In this video, we'll explore the XP FluidFX solver settings. We'll compare simulations using different accuracy levels. We'll understand fluid density and how to control it. And we'll look at other settings like internal pressure, external pressure, and damping. So let's get started. In this scene, we have a large-scale drop tank using XP FluidFX to solve the fluid simulation. So let's just hit play and see what we've got. We've got a nice box emitter. It's emitting these particles and they're behaving in this fluid-like way and cascading their way down this tank. We've got some kind of stone rock objects and they pool together here and then they're eventually flowing down into these closed, squared off containers. And it's a nice simulation. It's working really well. It has a definite fluid-like feel to it and it's simulating pretty quickly. We're getting really nice live playback in our viewport here. So let's have a look at what is making up this scene. If we go to our XP system, we can have a look in our Dynamics tab and we have an XP FluidFX object. So this is one of the fluid solvers that you get in the X-Particles toolkit. So that is active and that's helping create our fuel. We have an emitter and it is a box emitter here. And if we just have a quick look at those settings, if we go to the Object tab, we can see that it's set to box. If we go to the Emission tab, we can see that it is set to hexagonal emission, and it's going to start on frame 2 and finish emitting on frame 30. There's no speed, and the particles have a radius of 3 centimeters. So the reason the particles are falling to the ground, they have no speed, it's because we have some modifiers in the scene, namely a XP gravity modifier, which of course is pulling them down. And we also, if you can have a look in the hierarchy, have an XP wind modifier with a box field. So let's just make those active and you can see what that is doing. So the XP wind is blowing in this direction on the -Z, and the box field means that the wind is only affecting the particles once they get into this area. And what the wind is there for is to just give the particles a helping hand to blow them down into these 3 confined square tubes. So that is our basic scene. Now, obviously, our particles are interacting with the geometry that is in this scene. So how do we set that up when we're using XP FluidFX as the fluid solver? Well, let's go into our utilities. We'll just make that wind invisible again. Let's go into our utilities folder. This is where our geometry is. And there's a few different pieces of geometry here. There is a fluid container wire object. Now, this is just a dummy object, really. It's not doing anything. The particles aren't interacting with it. It's just there to give us this nice visual, simple wireframe outline of the collider geometry that we are using to contain our particles. So let's just switch that one off for now because that isn't actually involved in the solve. And then we have a fluid container polygon object, which is a child of an XP join object, which joins different polygon objects together. So our XP fluid container object looks like it is just these flat plane floor surfaces with a few rocks. We don't have any walls or a ceiling to this geometry, but of course we do have them there. They're just not visible. You can see the particles rebounding off that wall, for instance, as they make their way into this part of the tank. And all we've done here is we've hidden some of the polygons just to make it easier to see what the fluid is doing. So just to demonstrate that, if we go to our fluid container, let's go to poly mode, and if we go to the select and unhide all, it'll unhide all those polygons, and there you can see that is the actual geometry that we're using to contain our particles. So it's a sealed volume and it's got all flat surfaces apart from this underneath section where we have got these indentations which are extruding inwards, which are becoming our rock surfaces. So let's just hide those once more. We'll go to select and let's hide unselected polygons. So click that, and then we've hidden those again. Let's go back to object mode, and we'll put our dummy wireframe object on just so we can make sense of how the particles are moving. And so that is it. And one of the advantages with XP FluidFX is that it uses polygon collisions. And that means that you can use any Cinema 4D object or generated object and put an XParticles collider tag on it, and it will interact with fluid particles. So we have our fluid container within an XP join, and that XP join has got just a regular XParticles collider tag on it, and that means that the particles are colliding with those polygon surfaces and the rocks. And the reason that we put this in a XP join rather than just putting a collider tag on the fluid container itself is that we can now drop any other object within this XP join, and it too will act as a fluid collider. So we have a cube here. Let's activate this cube, and we can see here is the cube in our viewport, and we've got a vibrate tag on that. So let's just deactivate the emitter. So now we have an animated collision object in our scene, and it's using the same collider tag, but because we've got our cube as a child of our XP join, this will be considered a collider object too. So let's reactivate our emitter, hit play, and you're going to see that we're going to get some really nice interaction between the moving collision object and our water particles. And you can see they're really going to start, splashing around and moving those particles around in our scene. Again, it's still simulating pretty quickly, and we've got a very nice effect. Okay, so for now, let's just deactivate that cube collider. So that is our basic scene, and FluidFX, one of its advantages is that it uses the XParticles polygon collision system, so you can use any Cinema 4D object or generated object or MoGraph clones to be your fluid colliders, and you can also use flat surfaces that are only one polygon thick. So for example, a normal plane, it'll interact perfectly and you'll get perfect collisions with your XP FluidFX. Other fluid solvers can't use single poly thick objects as colliders because they can't be sampled correctly. So I'm thinking particularly of XP Fluid Flip that uses voxels to solve the fluid simulation, and those collision objects need to be sampled by the voxels, and it has to be a volume object. It can't just be a one polygon thick object like a plane. So let's move on now and just have a quick look at our emitter settings. Now what we're seeing here, we're emitting these particles. You can see the display mode that we have chosen here are these pyramids. So we've got these pyramid display modes, and we've also got, if we go to our emitter and we go to the extended data tab and we go to the general data, we have activated rotation and we've activated tangential rotation. And that just means that these particles will always be facing in the direction of their travel, and it's a useful display mode when looking at fluids because you can get a really good idea of how the fluid flow is working. Look at them going around these rocks, and then you're going to see some nice swirls happening around here, and this is made easier to visualize with this type of display mode with our tangential rotation set on. You don't need to do this because of course when it comes to render time, most of the time you're not going to be rendering these fluid particles, you'll just be using them to create a mesh. But for setting up simulations and to see how your simulation is working and how your flow is working, it's a useful display method to adopt. Okay, so let's have a look at XP FluidFX because it is arguably the most versatile of the fluid solvers in XParticles, and that is for one particular reason. The way in which you manipulate FluidFX is there are two different areas. In the actual FluidFX object itself, this is where you control the simulation settings of your fluid solve. This is how you dictate the accuracy of that solve. This will make it faster to simulate, to play in the viewport and to render, or it'll make it slower to simulate, but you'll get a much more accurate simulation and result. And all of that is done in the XP FluidFX object itself. However, adjusting the actual fluid properties, like the vorticity, like the surface tension, like the viscosity, that is done not in the solver itself, but in the individual emitter. So if we go to our XP emitter and we go to our extended data tab, we have a fluid data tab. Now, this fluid data is only to be used for XP FluidFX. Now, why is this separated from the actual solver itself, you may ask? Well, it's quite simple. It gives us the ability to have one solver in our scene, and we can have multiple different emitters where we can mix fluids of different qualities. So we could have a very viscous, sticky, gloopy liquid mixing with a much more water-like liquid, or we could have a water ocean mixing with a granular snow simulation, and we can have as many emitters as we like in our scene with very different settings, but only one XP FluidFX solver going on. So it gives you an awful lot of options, and it makes this solver incredibly versatile. So before we look at any of our fluid properties settings, of course we've said these can be found in the emitter, let's have a look at the actual XP FluidFX settings themselves, because this is where we set up the accuracy of the solve itself, which is highly important to get right. So let's have a look at our XP FluidFX settings, and everything that we have been looking at so far, the settings have been set to the default settings, which are nice and fast to simulate. The only thing that isn't default is we have check density active. By default, this is switched off, and I'll explain and we'll demonstrate and work out exactly what that's doing in a couple of moments. But everything else is default, and as you can see, we're getting our particles emitted from our emitter, and they're being affected by the modifiers, by the gravity and the wind, but they're also being made to move in this nice fluid-like way by the XP FluidFX. And what's happening is this: in XP FluidFX, each particle is looked at, interpreted as an individual fluid element, and the movement of those particles are dependent on the neighbouring fluid particles as well. And what is happening is this: first of all, FluidFX solves the movement of those particles. That's the first stage of the calculation. So the velocity of the particles is calculated first. Then when it's worked out the velocity of the particles, it then works out the fluid density of each of those particles. And the basic way this works is, if you have lots of particles in quite a small volume, then they're going to have a high fluid density value. If you have far fewer particles in the same volume, they'll have a much lower fluid density value. Once this fluid density value is worked out, then it works out the pressures on the particles and the forces, all ready to work out the next velocity step in the solve, which is where the particles are going to move to. And then the density is worked out again, which will influence how the next velocity step will work, and so on. And so that is how the system works. And the way in which that you increase the accuracy of the simulation, making it more realistic and more stable, is to increase the steps used to calculate the movement of the particles, the velocity, and to increase the amount of solver iterations that are made to get that fluid density as accurate as possible. So that is a basic theoretical description of what's happening, but let's see visually what the difference is between having a more accurate or a less accurate simulation. So here we have a simulation on fast, and it's looking pretty good. We're getting a fluid body. The solver is able to maintain the volume of this pool here. The particles haven't collapsed on themselves, so it's maintaining that fluid volume. It's pouring down, and look, it's gradually filling up these enclosed spaces. So let's watch that fill up. So here it comes, it splashes down. The particles are obviously interacting with each other correctly. We're getting this fluid swirling nice motion. We're getting fluid volume. And look, this is now filling up as we're getting more and more particles in there. So even on the fast preset, we're getting a pretty nice fluid simulation. And in some scenes, this might be perfectly accurate for the look that you need. And in that instance, it's wonderful because it simulates really quickly, it'll cache really quickly, and obviously render really quickly as well. So that's great. However, let's look at one of the problems of this simulation. So these particles are being coloured via their speed. So the faster particles are lighter and the slower particles are this darker blue. Now let's just dolly in. Have a look at these particles in this area where they are rushing down and then they're slowing and filling up and creating this pool. And you can see that we're getting flashes of light particles, continuous, angry, noisy flashes of particles. So what's that saying? Well, that is saying that we have vast variations of speed in these particles in this enclosed space. And that's not right. That's not accurate. It shouldn't have these really noisy changes in speed. So let's see what happens if we increase our accuracy to say high. What's going to happen is FluidFX is going to divide each frame into more sub-steps, which means that it's easier to solve these fast-moving particles. And it's also going to include much more iterations to get that density solve accurate. And it's going to have a couple of different effects. Let's hit play. So you're going to see that it's solving a bit more slowly because it's making lots more calculations, but it looks pretty similar. But when we get down to here, you're going to find that we're going to have far less of that flashing of speed. We're still getting a little, but it's far less. And look how more quickly this is filling up until it's completely full and we have far less flashing. So what that is saying is two things. It is more accurately solving that velocity, so it's not incorrectly having particles with vastly different speed differences from frame to frame, but it also is maintaining the volume of that fluid because we have a much more stable fluid density value being calculated, and a result of that is this closed portion is filling up way more quickly than it was before, because before the fluid must have been compressing too much, which isn't realistic. So let's change this now to the highest accuracy setting, and in this setting you're going to see, look, so you can see that it's much more slow to simulate. But the benefit is that our velocity and our fluid density solve is going to be way more accurate. And what you're going to see is when this fluid starts coming down into our confined space, that flashing of velocity where the particles are changing in speed erratically is going to have disappeared. It's gone. The fast particles are coming in, slowing down, and then we are filling up. And it's filling up far more quickly than it was before because we're not losing any of that volume of our fluid. And we have a much more realistic and a much more stable solve. So let's do a side-by-side example so we can see exactly the difference between the fast accuracy and the accurate accuracy. So here we have a hardware render of both of our systems, so of course exactly the same simulation, but one has the XP FluidFX accuracy settings set to fast, and the one on the right is set to accurate. So let's just have a look at this simulation, and they look very similar, But if we have a look down this area, you can see what we've already just looked at. We have got this flashing of light particles, which is indicating that we're getting big kind of variance in speed per frame of these particles, which shouldn't be happening. And we also have got this volume is filling up rather slowly, and that is suggesting that we're losing some of the volume of that liquid. It is compressing somewhat, which it shouldn't. So then if we have a look at our accuracy accurate solve, and again we come down here and we haven't got those very quick and heavy changes in velocity, and we're also getting this volume filling up here very quickly because we're not getting any loss of fluid volume. But also, let's have a look at some of the other features of these two different simulation modes. If we have a look at accuracy fast, let's have a look at this section of our simulation as we play. And what you're going to get with fast simulating FluidFX scenes is a much more kind of frenetic, splashy looking solve. Let's just play that one more time. And if you look at the same section on our accurate solve, we're going to have a much smoother, more cohesive flow of water. And that is due to the way in which the solver is working. On accurate fast, the particles have got far fewer calculations per frame. So effectively, the particles are moving a lot further distance before their next simulation solve. And what that, especially in a fast-moving simulation like this, what that means is that the fluid density solve isn't as stable as if it would be inaccurate, because between one frame to the next, it's quite likely that you'll suddenly get lots of particles very close to each other, and that is going to cause a higher density situation, a higher density pocket, which is going to cause pressures and acceleration to move those particles away in the next velocity solve, which means you're going to get a much more frenetic look. Whereas because we have so many more steps, the particles are moving far less distance before their next solver iteration in our accurate solve, it means that we're getting a much more consistent fluid density, and that's giving us this really nice smooth flow without loss of volume, and it's kind of also managing to maintain flow and get some nice momentum building within the solve. And it depends entirely on your look. It may be that you're going for ultimate accuracy, and if that is the case, you need to go for a solve that's more accurate. But it may be that this fast accuracy style of sim that is a bit more splashy and a bit more frenetic, that may work for your scene. And if so, that's excellent, because it's much quicker to solve. So let's just run through that one more time, and we can see the difference in those solves. The accurate gives a more accurate simulation, more consistent velocity changes, the fluid density is more consistent throughout, we've got less loss of volume, and we've got this nice, consistent, smooth fluid flow. Now, just before we move on to another scene, let's just quickly explore the check density setting, which I said is off by default, but we have this active. And the reason we have this active is the way in which we have our emitter set up. Now, this is good to demonstrate what the check density does, but it also gives you an idea of how important the fluid density solve is as part of the FluidFX calculation. So what we're going to do is we're going to put our accuracy back down to fast so we get fast playback. And we're going to dolly into our emitter. And what we're going to do is we're going to switch check density off. And if we have a look in our emitter settings, we go to the emission tab, and we have the emission set to hexagonal. The particles have no speed, and they have a radius of 3. So what's going to happen is if I just switch FluidFX off for now, we go forward the first frame, and what the emitter has done, it has spawned these particles in an hexagonal grid, and it has spawned them so that it is able to fill the box completely without any of those particles intersecting. So it uses the particle radius to work that out. If you have a smaller radius, if I put this down to 1, you'll see that there'll be far more particles, because obviously more particles, if they are smaller, can fit within this volume. Let's put that back to 3, and we'll go forward a frame. Now, if we were only emitting on one frame, this wouldn't be a problem in FluidFX. So let's just set that up. Let's emit on frame 2 and end emit on frame 3. And let's switch FluidFX back on. And if we go to FluidFX, we have check density off now. And if we hit play, the particles are born and they fall down. Now we have a little bit of an explosive bounce out. And that's because we are emitting over 2 frames. Let's put this end emit onto 2. So now we're only emitting on 1 frame. And you'll see we haven't got that kind of explosive bulge that we had when we were emitting over 2 frames. Now it's just dropping down and looking fine. But if we put this on to, say, now it's emitting on frame 2, 3 and 4, so that's 3 frames, we're getting even more of kind of this blasting out of particles, almost like they're pressurized. And then if we increase that to frame 6, even more of a blast. So we're creating a pressurized system here, and they're blasting out, and we don't want that. We want them just to fall down. So why is it happening? Well, this is due to the way in which FluidFX is working out this fluid density value. On the first frame, the particles are born. They are not born in a high density state, but if we go forward another frame, suddenly twice as many particles are now within that same volume. So immediately XP FluidFX says, well, we've got way more particles in the same volume. That means the fluid density value must be much higher. That causes a high pressure situation, which means the particles blast outwards. If we go forward another frame, now we have tripled the amount of particles that were in that first frame into pretty much the same volume, which means that fluid density is even greater, which means that we have more pressure. And then we add more particles into virtually the same volume, and the same thing happens. And that's why we're getting this blast of particles, because we're just pumping more and more particles into the same volume pretty much, which is causing this high fluid density value, these explosive forces, and then the particles are accelerating and blasting outwards in this very frenetic way, which we don't necessarily want. So this actually shows that the solver is working correctly. It's doing what it should do, but this look isn't the behavior that we want. So how do you pump as many particles as possible into your scene without getting this explosive nature? Well, what we're able to do, let's go back to our emitter, and we'll put that end emit back on 30 frames. So we're going to get a really big emission now. We go back to XP FluidFX. What we can do is check density. And what that does, it checks when the particles are born, if they are born and given a very high density value, over 110% of the existing density value, then they will immediately be killed, to ensure that we don't create this high density, high pressure situation. So with it on the default, it lets it be slightly higher than 100%. Hit play. And now we're getting this constant stream of particles, but because we're killing any particles that are being born with a very high density value, we're not getting that pressure. It also means that we're not getting as many particles in our simulation, and we can see just how many it's culling by activating the emitter hood. So let's do that. We'll go to our emitter, let's go to the display tab, we'll go to the hood tab, and we'll show hood, and let's go. So with FluidFX, with our check density on, if we go forward to say frame, let's go to frame 20. On frame 20, with check density on, which is killing particles with a density greater than 110%, we have just under 8,000 particles. Let's switch off check density and go through to frame 20. So it's obviously taking a lot longer. Look at this explosive blast of high pressure particles. Let's go up to frame 20. And look at the difference. It was 8,000, just under 8,000 particles. Now it's 72,000 particles. So by checking density, it has killed off a massive amount of particles because they all had a very high density value, causing this blasting effect. If we stick check density back on and increase this, so this will allow particles to have a little bit more, we might get a little bit of bulging, a bit of pressure in the sim. Let's have a look. Not much. Let's go up to frame 20, and now we have got just under 9,500 particles. So we have considerably more. It's killed off fewer. Let's increase that to, say, 170%. And still, we haven't really got much noticeable bulging in this, so we're getting away with this value. We're creeping up now closer to 10,000 particles. Let's put this on 190. And we're getting a little bit of bulging here as the particles are moving away. Now we've got 15,000 particles in our simulation. So checking density is a very useful setting to have if you want to have particles that are going to be constantly streaming into your sim, but it means that particles are going to be kind of appearing on top of existing particles. Then this is a way of killing those that are above the density threshold we set here to stop those kind of explosive blasts of fluid that we get at the beginning of the simulation. So check density, a very useful setting, especially in a scene like this where we have a continually emitting box emitter. So there are a couple more settings that we're going to look at, but to do that we're going to jump into a different scene. So this is going to enable us to explore some of the settings we've not looked at yet, including internal pressure, external pressure, and our damping. And to do that, we're going to dive into a different scene. So if we come into this flow field scene, this is going to demonstrate a couple of things. We'll be able to explore these settings in the XP FluidFX solver that we've not looked at yet, but also we can use a scene that is more of a mid-scale fluid scene, and it is obviously a less realistic one. We're going to be severely kind of art directing the flow of some fluid instead of the usual laws of nature taking their hold, like gravity, for example. So in this scene, what we have is an XP flow field, and the XP flow field has got, if we have a look at the attributes here, it's got 3 layers, and the main function of this flow field is to get particles, if we hit play, to come out of the emitter and follow the path of this spline. So the first along spline layer of our flow field is getting the particles to move along this spline, but obviously we're seeing quite a lot of particles which are losing that follow. So what we have got is a 2 spline layer as well, which is keeping the particles much more in check and following the path of this spline. And then we've also got a turbulence layer, which is giving us a nice bit of random turbulent movement to this particle stream. And it's looking really nice. But the problem is, by the time we get towards the end of this spline, all of the particles have clumped together into this very thin band. And that isn't what we want. So we want this to mimic being a fluid surface and volume. So what we can do is just use our very versatile fluid solver, XP FluidFX. So we have one in our object manager here. Let's activate it. And if we go into the settings, you'll see that we are completely at default settings. And on the default settings, if we hit play, what you'll see is that we're still getting the velocity information of the XP flow field. It's creating this really nice flow along the path of our spline. We're getting that nice turbulent waviness created by the turbulence layer, but we are getting a nice consistent volume of water all the way along this flow, and that's because our XP FluidFX is obviously doing its fluid calculation, and it is creating this very nice volume of water that isn't able to compress and lose that volume, which wouldn't happen in the real world, but it's still respecting all of that nice velocity information that we're getting from the XP flow field object. So let's have a look in our XP FluidFX settings. And as I said, this is just happening on our nice fast default settings. So we're getting really good viewport playback. And of course, we could art direct this. We could move the spline. The spline could be animated. There's lots of control that we can exert upon this. And as you can see, this isn't a physically accurate, realistic fluid simulation. There's no gravity in our scene acting like fluid would in the real world. So let's have a look at some of the settings that we've not looked at yet. We have an internal pressure setting and an external pressure setting. And in their defaults, they're set to 130. And for most intents and purposes, you can leave these on their default settings and they're going to work perfectly for your scene. You very rarely really need to adjust these settings. But what they are doing they're doing two things. The internal pressure is keeping the fluid particles from collapsing on themselves. It's keeping them apart, as they should do, because fluids shouldn't compress. But then the external pressure is then helping them maintain and become one kind of cohesive fluid body. It's keeping those particles together. So we've got a bit of a push and a pull of opposing forces here. And a way to demonstrate that, if we get rid of all of this internal pressure and hit play, you're going to see that the fluid, even though our FluidFX is active, it loses its volume. All of these particles now are compressing and they are all creating one very thin stream of fluid, which of course is not physically accurate. However, it may be a look that you want. And if it is, you have the ability to change that internal pressure. If we put that internal pressure back up to, say, 50%, we are going to be able to keep these particles from bunching up too much. There is that internal pressure there forcing them apart, but it's going to allow a little more of that kind of unrealistic fluid compression, which may be an artistic look that you're going for. And if we put it back to the default 100, it's going to maintain that volume far more easily. And that's our default setting. So we also have a damping setting. And what this does, it damps all of the forces that are being put upon these fluid particles. And to demonstrate that, look, let's put our internal pressure at a very high amount, something like 300. And you're going to see that because there's such an internal pressure within this fluid volume, it's going to be really pushing those particles apart. Look, it's becoming very wide, our stream here, because that internal pressure is so great and the external pressure isn't strong enough to keep them within that tight volume. So one thing we could do, we could try increasing our external pressure, but now look what's happened. Now we have such a high internal pressure and such a high external pressure, the solver doesn't have enough accuracy to be able to solve these very, very powerful forces. So we haven't broken it. We just need to increase the accuracy of this simulation so it can iterate more times to be able to solve what has become a much more tricky calculation. So if we just put this up to, say, high, hit play, and now on high accuracy, with more iterations, the solver is able to calculate these very high, unrealistic internal and external pressure amounts. Let's just put that external pressure back down to the default of 30. We'll keep internal pressure very high at 300%. And let's just put our accuracy back down to fast. So the solver calculates all of these various forces which then make the particles move in the way in which they do. And we're able to damp those forces to a certain degree to get kind of simulations to calm down somewhat. So let's have a look at that. We can go to our damping, and we need very, very high amounts in here before you're going to see effective damping. So let's put a huge amount in here. We'll crank this way up to say, look, what have we got? We've got 1 million there. And can you see, look, we have damped down that internal pressure force on our particles. And even though it's set to 300, because we've damped all of the forces, including the internal pressure, now our particles haven't spread out quite so much. And they're mimicking a simulation that had far less internal pressure. So that's what the damping does. It damps down all of the forces upon our fluid particles. Let's put that back down to default. Let's put our internal pressure back down to the default 100. And then we can move on and play our medium scale nice flow field animation. So that's a nice example of how we can use FluidFX in a very stylized scene that isn't necessarily physically accurate as how fluid behave on Earth, for example. There's no gravity for one thing. But you can see that we can use it with other X particles tools like the XP flow field and other modifiers to create a very nice stable stream of fluid particles, even though those particles are being manipulated by other forces and modifiers.